The Southern Woods was a dark place. Every town and city that came near its borders had tales of evil things that occurred there. The forest had a knack for giving birth to folk tales and myths, but it had a knack for giving birth to a lot of other things as well. Very few knew this, but the Southern Wood was a gateway between this world and another far darker place. I am going to tell you a tale, one of many that comes from the Southern Wood. It begins in the town of Stevens Switch with a boy by the name of Thomas Carroll. The small town of Stevens Switch got its name from the train tracks that ran through it. Over the years the town prospered but remained small. It was enclosed in the hills and mountains of the region. Many who drove through the area didn't even know there was a town there. You could see no houses off the main road. To find anything of note in Stevens Switch, you would have to ride off onto one of the many back roads. If you did, you would discover the train station, restaurants, homes of all shapes, sizes, and expense, a gas station, a grocery store, a movie rental shack, and a school. These days, the most notable feature about the town was their winning high school football team, the Stevens Switch Fighting Bobcats. The whole town seemed to rally behind this high school sport, and the players of the sport were treated like celebrities within the city limits. I suppose that's where the problem started. Once you start treating people like they are above all else, they will start to believe it. Which brings us to Thomas Carroll. Thomas was a 17-year-old senior at Stevens Switch High School. He had moved here during the summer with his mother, Dorothy Carroll, who had gotten a divorce the previous year. Thomas's father had been a poor husband and an even worse father. Neither Thomas nor his mom missed the man, and they had moved here to get away from their past in the city. Tom was a small and slender boy. He had dark hair and wore glasses. He was seen as weak and strange by his fellow schoolmates, mainly because of the way he dressed. In the city, his clothes would have been perfectly acceptable, but out here they caused him to stand out. Within the first week at his new school, the quarterback of the football team, Mark Hollenbeck, had decided that Thomas would be the focal point of his teasing. Compared to all the other kids, Thomas was an easy choice. Mark, having grown up as a small-town idol, was vain and egotistical. He was also cruel. His first well-known act of cruelty took place in 5th grade when he superglued Delray Clemens' head to a toilet seat in a boys' bathroom. Throughout the course of that day, every boy in school was encouraged by Mark and his crew to use that toilet when they had to urinate. The next day, Delray had been sent off. He had had a nervous breakdown and had to receive counseling, and nothing was done to Mark. The school suspended a couple of boys that had urinated on Delray for a week, but they contended that they could not find out who had glued his head to the toilet seat, even though the culprit was well known by all. Mark and his crew were untouchable, it seemed. The group was made up of Mark, his best friend Jonah, Brian, and Travis. They were all on the football team, and they had all come from rich families in the town. This was Thomas's nemesis, and what a nemesis to have. Within the first 6-week period of school, Mark had managed to make Thomas's life a living hell. Mark had urinated in Tom's locker, given him a black eye, ridiculed him in class, and pulled down his shorts in PE. Tom dreaded going to school for fear of what Mark had planned for the next day. This continued for a while. Then in autumn, while Mark was being particularly mean, Tom lost it a bit and fought back. He took 2 quick swings with his fist, and the second one connected with Mark's face. The punch didn't seem to really hurt him, but it felt like time had stopped while everyone looked at Mark wondering what he was going to do. At that moment, Mr. DeWitt, the algebra teacher, walked up, so everyone dispersed, and Mark was not able to react. Over the next couple of days, the bullying stopped. No one could figure it out, least of all Thomas. He feared that he had only made things worse. 3 more days went by with no mishap of any kind. On the 4th day, things got even more surprising. Mark walked right up to Thomas and apologized for all of the things he had done. Over the next couple of days, Mark would hang out with Tom and would ask Tom to join him at their table in the lunchroom. Thomas was sitting with the most popular kids in school. He didn't know why, but he felt a swell of happiness that not only was the torture over, but that he had friends for the first time in almost a year. That coming weekend, Mark and his friends were planning a camp out by the river. That was where all the high school parties happened. Senior skip day, spring break, and the senior party all took place by the river in the southern wood. They were planning to camp out Saturday night and come back Sunday. Mark asked Thomas to come along, and Thomas was thrilled. Mark told him that they weren't supposed to be out there, so the trip had to be kept quiet. Thomas agreed, and that Friday he had packed a few things and had them waiting in his room for Saturday, when he was to leave. He told his mother he was planning to go hiking and camping and that he would be back the next day. Thomas was almost 18 and very smart, so his mother thought nothing of letting him go. When he left, he walked down the road a bit and waited for the guys to come by. About 20 minutes later, they swung by, picked him up, and they were off. Brian had brought some beer, Travis had brought some girly magazines, and Jonah had managed to get a hold of some weed. They were all set for a very fun night. They drove about 15 minutes and then hiked another 15 to get out to the site. Once there, they unpacked, got the campsite settled, and started the party. It was early autumn, so it was still pretty warm enough for them to swim a bit in the river. They took turns swinging out over the water on a rope that was tied to a large tree branch and then jumping in. They didn't have to worry about cracking their skulls on rocks because this particular part of the river was almost 20 feet deep. They swam around until the sun started to go down, and then they started a good fire. They huddled around it, getting dry and warm, and started cracking open the beer. They started joking around, getting a bit drunk, and even got a little high. As the night came upon them, a low fog creeped over the area, but they were all having too much of a good time to notice. They soon changed into warmer clothes and got their tents set up before returning to sit around the fire. Around 10 o'clock that night, Tom was sitting comfortably by the fire listening to Brian and Travis talk about their last game. Jonah was returning to the site with more wood for the fire, and Mark was thumbing through a magazine. Then Mark made a comment about one of the girls in the magazine he was looking at, which didn't seem strange at first, but it was a signal. All at once, Tom felt a thunk on the side of his head as Jonah clubbed him with a piece of firewood. As Tom fell to the ground, the others all jumped on him like a flock of vultures. Tom cried out for them to stop and for help as they stripped him bare. They ripped and tore through his clothes and threw the shreds into a pile. Soon, Thomas lay naked upon the cooling dirt of the forest floor. Wet leaves stuck to his body and tears started to well up in his eyes. Tom pleaded with them to stop and occasionally asked why they were doing this as the three young men tied him to a large tree nearby. They used the remnants of Tom's clothes to fashion a gag that they placed in his mouth. After that, his questions and screams were silenced. Tom remained there in silence for several moments. His mind started to wildly grasp for some answer. Then, all at once, Tom understood the plan. It was all a farce. Mark's apology and the group's friendship all had been a ploy to get him out here in the middle of nowhere, a place where no one could hear his cries for help. He had bought it, too. Tom at once thought himself so smart, but now he felt like an idiot. How could he have missed this? How could he have fallen for such an obvious trick? He was ashamed, and it showed upon his red face.
"How could you think that guys like us would hang out with a freak like you?"
Mark asked, standing right in front of Tom. Mark had a large, satisfied smile across his face. The other three just stood behind Mark, cackling like hyenas. Then Mark suddenly punched Tom as hard as he could in Tom's stomach. Tom felt the breath being knocked out of him. He felt like throwing up, but the gag would have caused a complication. Tom used all of his will to keep from vomiting.
"Nobody punches me and gets away with it,"
Mark said as he raised his fist again.
"Especially not some freak like you!"
For the next few moments, Mark used Tom's body like a punching bag, but then he signaled for his friends to join in. They spent the next hour coming up with different forms of torture. They caned his legs, made a game of throwing clumps of mud at him, even tried to carve words like worthless and piece of shit into his skin with a hunting knife. They discovered that carving words into skin was a lot harder than it looked, and gave up after doing a sloppy job with the previous mentioned words. The verbal torments continued as well, while Mark and his friends stayed unrelenting in their assaults. Travis began slapping Tom's face while Brian pulled Tom's hair to hold his head in place. Thomas felt sick as Jonah forced mud, leaves, insects, and worms into Tom's mouth. Tom couldn't believe what was happening. The pain was insufferable. Tom thought about his mother and began to cry. Soon the only part of his face that wasn't covered in dirt were his cheeks where the tears had run down. Not too long after that, Thomas started to drift in and out of consciousness. Tom was only partially aware when the guys untied him from the tree and let his body collapse to the ground. He didn't notice at all when they started tying a rope around his ankles, but he came to just as they threw the rock that the other end of the rope was tied to into the river. Tom screamed and scratched at the passing dirt as his body was dragged into the cold depths of the rushing water. He watched the faces of his attackers staring down at him, illuminated by the fire and moonlight as he sank deeper into the river. He felt such anger looking at them. Soon, all Thomas saw was darkness as he slipped from his life. Cold river water filled Thomas's lungs, and he was dead. Months passed, and eventually the search for Thomas was abandoned. Thomas's mother committed suicide a few weeks after the search ended, but it wasn't long after that life returned to normal in Stevens Switch. The football team became state champions, and the quarterback was praised for his talent. Mark was offered several scholarships to play at numerous colleges in the state. Senior party eventually came around, and considering all they had to celebrate, Mark and his crew decided to go back down to the river for a party. It would be the first time they had gone down there since the night Tom vanished. They packed their usual party supplies and headed off for that evening. They arrived at the campsite around 35 minutes later, where they proceeded to drink and party like wild men. They told stories of the women they had fucked, all lies, and spread gossip about classmates they didn't like. The night continued on as midnight approached and a low-hanging fog returned. If the boys hadn't been so completely oblivious, they would have noticed that the crickets had stopped chirping, the birds had flown away, and a storm was on the horizon. Within the hour, the wind picked up, the fog somehow got thicker, and rain began to drizzle. The boys quickly set up a tarp to sit under and then started to complain that their night was ruined when bubbling noises rose up from the river. At first they didn't notice the sound due to the noises of the wind and rainfall, but as the sound got louder, it caught Jonah's attention. He had been glancing over at the river off and on all night, but when he turned his attention to the river this time, he saw a dim green light emanating from deep below the churning river's surface. Jonah nudged Mark's arm with his elbow to get his attention. Mark turned to Jonah with an irritated look in his eyes, and just as Mark was about to complain about the nudge, he noticed what Jonah was looking at. The green light from under the water was getting brighter. Mark's eyes widened as he emerged from under the tarp and began to walk towards the river's edge. Jonah, Brian, and Travis followed close behind. Their mouths dropped open as a form surfaced and walked towards the shoreline. Mark's eyes almost bulged out of his head when he realized who it was. Thomas's body was walking directly towards them. The rope around his ankles was worn and chewed. It was no longer connected to a rock. Mark could still make out the words that they had carved into his skin. As Thomas continued to creep out of the water, the forest seemed to come alive. Branches began whipping about, roots started ripping up from the ground, and weeds slinked up from the water around Thomas Carroll's lumbering form. Jonah fell to the ground as a vine wrapped around his legs. Brian and Travis soon followed suit. Mark continued to watch, transfixed upon the sight before him. He was unable to move, and a puddle of piss surrounded the area where he was standing.
"This isn't fucking happening!" Mark screamed. "We fucking killed you!"
Mark shook his head from side to side as if to tell himself that he was hallucinating. Brian began clawing at the ground, trying to get away. Travis curled into a ball and began to shake uncontrollably. The mottled gray body before them pointed at Mark and spoke.
"Revenge is best served cold,"
it said in a gurgling voice. At once, the vines and roots began to rip off all of their clothes. They began shivering as the cold, damp air touched their naked skin. Thomas turned to Brian and Travis.
"You are always together, always a team, so it's only fitting that you be punished together as well."
The vines pulled back on Brian and Travis. They were bound by their wrists and ankles and spread open like a buffet. A swarm of leeches burst forth from the river. The leeches quickly covered their bodies, and soon they started to feel lightheaded from the blood loss. The two men jerked and screamed from the pain, but when they opened their mouths, handfuls of leeches rushed into their throats. It didn't take long before the two passed out. Their bodies were pulled into the river where the leeches could finish their meal in private. Jonah witnessed the deaths of Brian and Travis as roots burst from the ground and bound him from head to toe. He screamed as they started piercing his skin and worming their twisted way into his body. More and more of them kept coming up from the ground, and they continued to feed themselves into Jonah's wounded body. Jonah was shaking from shock and screaming as Thomas stepped in front of him. Thomas stared into his eyes as several roots dug their way into his chest cavity. Jonah convulsed and died painfully. The roots and vines then pulled him into the ground. No sign of him was left on the surface. Thomas walked towards Mark, who had stumbled back under the tarp. Mark backed himself up against the very tree where they had tied Thomas up. He had seen all that had happened and knew there was no escape.
I'm so sorry. Please don't kill me.
Mark begged. Thomas reached down and picked Mark up with supernatural strength and threw Mark over his shoulder. He carried Mark towards the water. Mark kicked and screamed, trying to break away, but it was no use. They sank into the glowing green depths. Mark felt Tom's claws digging deep into his skin. Right before their heads went under, Thomas said,
"It's lonely down here. I could use some company."
The water swirled around them as the green light dissipated and they disappeared into the darkness. Mark screamed until his lungs gave out and the cold water rushed in to replace the air. Then he was taken by death. After a month, the townspeople of Stevens Switch gave up search for the missing boys. The next crop of high school football players began training for the next year, and soon things returned to normal. The town talked about the chances the team had to make the playoffs and other topics of that nature. Years later, rumors started spreading about the haunted campsite by the river. The rumors soon became a folk tale about a group of senior boys that had died at their senior party, their spirits still haunting the place. Only rarely would people go down there, and when they did, they would return with scary tales. They would swear that at night the fog would roll in and they could hear screaming coming up from the river. What they didn't know was that screaming was coming from Mark as he was tortured continuously for Thomas Carroll's entertainment. One can hide their misdeeds under oceans of shadows and sorrow, but they will arise. If not today, then tomorrow.